When the missal stand is brought to the other side of the altar to set up, now it is facing at a 45-degree angle to the center because that's how it's going to be used. And the pastor is not going to leave this center position during this part of the liturgy at all until he actually goes for the distribution. And then after the distribution, the altar has to be turned back around again. The advantages of a freestanding altar are that it actually does blend the sacramental and sacrificial aspects of the service. And that is a strength in a certain sense because these things are not that clear. For example, Luther is emphatic that the words of institution are proclamation. And so it makes a certain amount of sense for the pastor to be facing the people because he's actually, God is speaking these words to the people rather than the words of institution being a sacrifice where the people are bringing it to God. So that's the kind of strength that a freestanding altar gives. There are certainly many strengths of an Eastern-facing altar as well, and we could debate the merits one way or the other. Most of us don't really have a lot of choice. We have the altar and the chancel that we've inherited, and so that's what it is. But certainly there are some advantages and distinctions in a freestanding altar. And the biggest one being the idea of the words of institution being proclamation, and also the more clear demonstration that the altar is for us in Christ a table, rather than something upon which things are sacrificed. So the missal stand is brought around, and now we've got that done. And then, this is all during the offering, now we need to prepare the vessels for the Holy Communion and also bring the elements to the altar. You could, of course, also at this point bring the veiled chalice to the altar. We don't do that here, even though that is very strong a testament in the history of the church, mainly because we have these nice veils and burses. And if you bring it out veiled, you immediately unveil it, and it's sort of almost never seen that way. So I like it being there. I like it being there not just because it's pretty, but I like it to be there the entire service, to be a visual reminder of where we're headed, that we've come here to hear God's word and to receive the Holy Communion, and this is here, though it's in a veiled format, so that everybody knows that. So for us, it's already on the altar. You might bring it. What's not on the altar is the bread and wine. And I think that this is an important thing, that in the most ideal world, the Ladies' Aid, the altar guild, does not actually put wine in the chalice or bread in the things that are going to be consecrated, or does at least not have them on the altar, because the pastor wants to have the right amount for the people that are gathered. The altar guild often views the setup of Holy Communion much the way that they view hospitality at church dinners. And they are just often very nervous that they're going to run out. And they think that would be the worst crime possible, is to not have enough bread and wine for Holy Communion. And so they make really kind of no effort to have the right amount, but instead it's like a cornucopia, a stack of individual cups and, hundreds of hosts, even though they've not had that many people even on Easter Sunday. That is really unfortunate, because then way more is consecrated than is needed. And I really think that the ideal practice is to consecrate the right amount, as close as possible, for the people that are going to receive Holy Communion in that worship service right then, so that everything is consumed. I'm not a big fan of reserving consecrated elements to take to the shut-ins later. I have many brothers that I deeply respect that think that's a great practice. I'm familiar with their arguments, and of course there's great history behind that. I think that the better practice is to consume everything in actually the context of the service, even before the benediction, so that there's no questions about what has been done with it, that no one would think or be afraid that we're treating it irreverently or disrespectfully, or that we're doing idolatrous things with it, God forbid. And also then, so that we wouldn't carry consecrated elements in our cars to the shut-ins while rock music is playing, or, and all of those sorts of various things. There's just all sorts of ways for things to go bad, and for that to end up in a kind of irreverent place. In fact, I had one friend of mine who was against me on this for years, and he got semi-converted to my way of thinking because the church got broken into midweek. And they had the consecrated body and blood. And sadly, this thief, he didn't know it was the blood of Christ. He thought it was wine, and he stole it, and he drank it. And if everything would have been consumed in the service, that wouldn't even be a possibility. So I urge you to consider that. Now, some might find resistance on setting up the right amount, but let me just say a few more things on this. I think that actually, though it requires a little bit more forethought and planning, in the first place, I think it's actually more pastoral, that we're paying attention, and I think the altar guild and the elders can be brought on board. It's actually not that hard in most of our congregations. Our attendance doesn't vary that wildly week from week. We got a pretty good idea the average number that's going to come. And if we want to put in 5 or 6 more, it's going to be enough that even if we're over, we would be able to consume it very easily. And if we need to consecrate during the service, we consecrate more during the service. So what's going to require, it's going to require a little bit more attention to detail in the setup, because you're going to have to set up for kind of your expected attendance, roughly, and then the pastor is going to need to know how many's in there, and then you're going to need readily available, very handy. In our case, we just go to one of these sacristies, and we have more ready that we can easily bring out and consecrate more if we've been off. And that has for sure happened. But it's not that big a deal. It's easy to do. And I think it's worth it. Now, the altar guild might not like it because now they have to count hosts and they have to measure wine. But I don't think it's that much to ask of them. And I think if you explain it, they'll understand it. Other congregations will sometimes get upset by the pastor consuming everything at the altar after distribution. Admittedly, this doesn't make any sense to me at all. I don't know why this would bother them. They should prefer it. And I think that actually if you explain to them, first of all, if you're not drinking, 4 cups of wine because you had way too much, that's not a good idea. If you have about the right amount and then you're consuming it, but if you explain to them that this is the most reverent treatment of this, that God intended the sacrament that we would eat and drink it, and therefore you're fulfilling his command, I think they're going to mostly be convinced. Because usually lay people are easily convinced by the Bible, unlike clergy persons who think they know more. So really, you've got a good argument here, and I think if they see that you're not doing superstitious things with it, that you're trying to protect it, they're going to be pretty easily convinced. If they absolutely cannot be, I still think you should try to consecrate the right amount, that you shouldn't consecrate stuff you know won't be used. And then, if you can't, if they don't like seeing you consume it at the altar, then you need to do it immediately after the benediction as soon as you can get back. And then things need to be abluted and cleansed. We'll talk about that afterwards. So the setup then, takes the pastor takes the burse off. If you have a nice burse, then you can set it up. Otherwise, you can lay it flat. We set ours up. And then the veil is taken off and is folded neatly and placed to the side. Then the pastor will, at this point, now you're ready to bring the bread and the wine. The celebrant's host is already on the paten, but the hosts that are going to be used for the distribution are slightly different. Once the chalice and paten are ready, then the pastor goes and gets the vessels that have the rest of the elements in it. So he simply needs to have this handy and ready. This is about what he expects to use. And we have a formula that basically 1/2 of a cup of wine will commune 20 people. So we actually measure with a measuring cup so we have the right amount and we're ready if we have to add. The other thing that I forgot to say was that the pastor then, in most of our churches, can easily actually count heads during the hymn of the day. It's just not that difficult because our congregations usually don't have that many more than 150 people. And we can usually kind of estimate because we're used to it and we can tell. If that is really a problem, you could have the ushers count during the service and bring you a number during the offering of the people that you expect to commune so that you could have a good estimate and be within a few. Then the pastor, so when the pastor brings this to the altar, he brings the vessels that are ready, Make sure they're supposed to have. At this point, he puts the wine, some wine in the chalice. It's not ideal to ever consecrate an empty vessel. At the same time, I don't like a lot of wine in the chalice for the consecration because I'm going to be moving it around and lifting it up. So I really prefer to have just enough in the chalice really to commune me and the acolytes that are going to be up here, and then it will be filled before we start the rest of the distribution. So some wine is put into the chalice, and then the lid's put back on. The lid is left on the ciborium. A single purificator is placed over the celebrant's host on the paten, and then the pall is put back over the chalice. And now we're ready for the liturgy. And this is mainly has to do with hygiene, that we don't want a fly to land in here or something. And we're not quite, it's ready and it's staged, but we're not quite ready to consecrate yet. And then when this is all ready, I simply step back and I wait for the offering to conclude, and then and if they've begun it, the offertory, so the created me. And that might be reversed in your situation. But in any case, now we're ready for the rest of the liturgy. The next thing that's going to come for us is the prayers of the church. We also make our announcements at this point. So some congregations make announcements before the service or after the service or not at all. But at some point it is useful, I think pastorally, to make the announcements of the intercessions. These are the people that need our prayers, that we know of, that have asked for our prayers. Grandma Schmidt, the family that's mourning, that sort of thing. And I think that's a very appropriate thing, again, to announce in the midst of the congregation. But we do announce more than that because this is our announcement session, and we try to keep it to somewhat of a minimum, and we try to keep, again, the tone reverent. But if necessary, for political reasons, or just because these things need they need the support of the pastoral office, not theologically, but just in terms of congregational life. Other things like the sauerkraut supper and the ladies' aid rummage sale and thank you to the Sunday school teachers or whatever else, that's also then going to be announced at this point. Doing it in the context of the worship service, I think, does actually help to calm the announcements down, at least from my perspective. There's less clowning around on my part, and also there's a certain distillation of only kind of what's most important. Everybody's mileage is probably going to vary on that. My associate pastor thinks I go a little too far, probably make more announcements than I need to, and he could be right, but he's the associate and I'm the senior, so I got to do what I want. And when he makes the announcements, he does what he wants. So you got to do it somewhere. That's how we do it. You do need, for sure, you could split it up. There definitely does need to be, before the prayers, announcements of those in need. And I think that is an important part of our intercessions and what we're called to be and to do for one another. I do not think it's a good idea. I know that the Missouri Synod provides resources for this. I do not think it's ideal practice, I should say, to have a different prayer of the church each week that matches thematically the themes of the day. That's what the collect does already. And I think that a better practice is to use a standard generic form of the prayer of the church that covers in a very broad way, but succinctly, all the conditions and sorts of men and their needs. And I think particularly distressing and uncomfortable is when pastors use prayer mainly to instruct and catechize their people, rather than to ask God for things. And certainly prayer is a broad term and it isn't just only asking God for things, but that's its primary definition. And in the prayer of the church, it's not primarily catechetical liturgically. The prayer of the church is actually bringing these intercessions before God and asking him for things. So a standard prayer of the church that remains the same week after week, or at least throughout a season, and that covers all of these things, I think is better than these individual thematic prayers.